When most people think about their fear of vulnerability, they think about it as being afraid to show their own vulnerability to other people. I'd argue that on a deeper level, a fear of vulnerability is actually a fear of looking at your own vulnerability inside yourself and has much less to do with other people. And I think that when you are able to turn inward and really look at your own vulnerability and face that and accept that, then real healing can begin. Hello, I'm Lewis, and I make videos on codependency, attachment theory, and all sorts of personal development topics. Today I'm going to talk about a fear of vulnerability, and this is something that I have dealt with a lot in my own life, so I feel quite happy to be able to talk about it and to share what I've learned about opening up and really showing my authentic self and my vulnerable sides to the world. So I'm going to start off by defining what is vulnerability, and I've got these definitions that I've sort of cobbled together from lots of different sources. And I would define vulnerability as the ability to take emotional risks, to be open and authentic in relationships, and to be comfortable not knowing and not being in control, or at least being perceived as that. So why do people not feel okay being vulnerable? I think that ultimately it comes down to one core reason, which is it doesn't feel safe. And it may well not have been safe even, and that's usually the case about why a fear of vulnerability comes out. It wasn't safe to show or to express those vulnerable, real core needs that you had. Often when you were a child, maybe when you were an infant, and there's loads of different reasons and ways in which that could have occurred. To talk about this from my own perspective, for me, I've struggled most of my life, actually, until the past year with being vulnerable. And having sort of spent the past year looking at that and feeling into that, I feel like it came from when I was very young, needing to be a certain way for the people in my life and not having the ability to express, or being shut down, often actually quite implicitly, from expressing the needs that I had, which were often emotional or spiritual. And that meant that as I grew up, as a child, as a teenager, even as an adult, whenever I sort of felt those needs, I wasn't even in touch actually with those needs. And I would just walk around, going about my life, feeling constantly anxious. And it's a really tricky one, that, because I feel like people who have a fear of vulnerability aren't fully aware of why that's the case. And yet they'll often know that something is wrong, because suppressing that vulnerability and suppressing those needs takes a lot of energy. And that energy makes you tired, it can make you feel depressed, it made me feel very anxious because it came out as me trying to control myself, and often also trying to control other people. Let's say that I go to work and I have my to-do list and I'm having my catch up with my manager, and I need to be fully on it, and I'm going to preemptively answer all of her questions, and I'm not going to give her a single moment to doubt that I'm not doing anything wrong, when perhaps I do need help. And I'm not ready to ask for that because it will make me feel like, oh, I need to be vulnerable, I need to ask for help. And then she'll have to see me be vulnerable and think, oh, wow, Lewis isn't perfect as an employee. I guess he's awful. And that feeling of perfectionism, I feel like, is what defended me from my own vulnerability. And looking more deeply at that, people say, oh, don't be a perfectionist, don't do this. And it's not very helpful to be a perfectionist. But you've got to look at why that happened. Why are you a perfectionist? And again, it goes back to, that's a coping mechanism for when you were much younger and you had needs that you had to express, and you had vulnerabilities that you had to own, and you weren't allowed to do that in whatever way. And so really, my anxiety and my perfectionism were signs that I had to open up. And actually, it was my anxiety that ultimately drove me to get therapy. What happened is, throughout uni and throughout my first real big job, I get very anxious. But in that job, I got quite a juicy and weighty job with a lot of responsibilities. And I would just every month or so just start for a few days. I just have like anxiety attacks. And it would be debilitating and I couldn't work. And I thought, this is not how people work. I looked around at the other people in my office and I don't see them freaking out over what is really just, I have some things to do, but I'm too afraid to ask for help. And I've procrastinated because I'm too afraid to ask for help. And now it's much more of a situation than it would have been if I'd have just asked for help at the beginning. But even then, it's still not a big deal. And that was just draining all of my energy and my soul. And it made what, should have been quite an enjoyable career into something that I was terrified to do every day. And when I went to bed, I would be thinking about it. And when I woke up, as soon as my brain switched on, I would start thinking about it. And it just made it so hard to live. And from there, I thought, right, okay, I have to do something. I've been doing this for the best part of my entire life. Something has to change. And I went to therapy, and I even did the foundational sort of counselor training year. And I realized here that my fear of asking for help and my fear of being vulnerable had nothing to do with other people. My fear of being vulnerable was because I didn't want to admit my own vulnerability to myself. Because if I admitted my own vulnerability to myself, then I've got to accept all these weak and annoying parts, like I need to take breaks, I need to sleep more, I need to exercise and look after myself and eat healthily, and I have to just cater for the part of me that can't just constantly be perfect. I actually have to be true to myself. And facing that sucks. It sucks. And it caused me more pain not to face it than to face it. That was ultimately what drove me to start looking inside myself and getting in touch with those parts of myself that wanted to be vulnerable and had this vulnerability that it needed to express. And I used some personality theory. I got in touch with my inner child, and I just found this little boy in me who was just crying out and just miserable and needed love and care and attention and just looking after. And what I found, I was quite shocked by that. And what I found was I had wrestled with this really difficult tension of how do I embrace this part of myself that is weak and needy and vulnerable. Now, vulnerability doesn't mean weakness necessarily, but this part of me was very fragile and very delicate. It was a child, and you can't expect a child to work, a demanding job and have adult relationships and have adult responsibilities. That's not, you wouldn't take your child into that. That would be abuse. And so I had to wrestle with, how do I carry around this child part of myself, this vulnerability, and get in touch with it while I'm living my normal life? And for me, finding a space that was safe for me to let that out was the key. And that space for me was therapy, and it was also my therapist training. And what I really found happened was I would spend time with myself, I would spend time with my child self. I'd be like, journaling, doing some visualization work, doing some drawing, even just sitting and sort of feeling it and contemplating. And I would find out all sorts of things. And I'd start to build a relationship with that child part of myself. And then I would take that and I would have to express it outwardly to the world, to my therapist, to my group. That's the terrifying part, because that's the fear of being seen and being vulnerable. Because it is, it's two things. I'm afraid to get in touch with my own vulnerability ultimately at the core, but being seen in that vulnerability is where I feel the change happens. It's almost like two parts. You go from esteeming yourself, getting in touch with yourself, and meeting those needs, and then getting the outside world to meet them. And well, what I discovered was, oh, people are okay with that. And so I went back and I got more in touch with my child self. And I went, let me see if I can show this to the world. And so I did. And it was okay. And that back and forth of getting in touch with myself and showing the world is really how I've come to accept my own vulnerability ultimately. And it was hard and it's still hard, and I've got so much more to go, and there's so much more of my authenticity that I want to bring into my life, my relationships, my professional life, all aspects, especially knowing myself, just for my own self. And what I've come to realize is it's all about being in touch with myself and accepting that, so that I know when it is appropriate to show my vulnerability and when it isn't. But fundamentally, I know that it is okay to be vulnerable, and that's a really difficult thing. As a young man, society doesn't necessarily support vulnerability. We've taken some steps, but you know, it's not. Seeing men cry, seeing men be anxious and afraid, and that's difficult for society to hold, and it's difficult for men, women, and everyone else in between, and or not at all, to hold. But getting in touch with it myself has made it easier for me to hold. And if I can hold it, I can take my vulnerability out into the world in a way that is safe and appropriate and true for me. And that really is how I've started overcoming and getting in touch with my real vulnerability and not being afraid to be myself anymore out there in the big, wide, scary world.